I'm David Knowles, and this is Ukraine, the latest. Today, we'll discuss the latest tactical and strategic news from Ukraine, talk about Boris Johnson's recent trip to the Ukrainian capital, and examine the potential ramifications of the ongoing French presidential election.
This hideous and barbaric venture of Vladimir Putin must end in failure.
Nobody's going to break us. We're strong. We're Ukrainians.
Every weekday afternoon, I sit down with leading journalists from the Telegraph's London newsroom and our teams reporting on the ground to bring you the latest news and analysis on the war in Ukraine. Just to say, for our regular listeners, our defence and security editor Dominic Nicholls is away this week. It's April the 11th, day 47. And today I'm joined by assistant comment editors Francis Dearnley and Olivia Utley, and Mutaz Ahmed. I started by asking Francis for the latest news from Ukraine.
It's been an eventful couple of days for various different reasons. And I think the best way to break it down is into sort of military, tactical and strategic, and then the diplomatic, which of course involves Boris Johnson visiting Kyiv, amongst other things. So in terms of the tactical picture, much has been made, of course, of the renewed attack on the Donbass by Russia in the eastern part of Ukraine. And it seems that almost all of the war focus is now there and in Mariupol. Russia has suffered considerably heavy losses, so much so that it is now said to be calling up soldiers who've been retired for more than a decade, according to Western intelligence. Not only that, since Russian forces withdrew from towns around Kyiv, Ukrainian investigators have been working rapidly to document evidence of war crimes, of which there's now, obviously, we've seen numerous examples of terrible atrocities that appear to have been committed in areas all around Kyiv and no doubt elsewhere. On that theme, Mariupol, which is obviously a city that has been besieged now by the Russians for several weeks, has been, in the words of President Zelensky, has been facing such an aggressive onslaught that now he's saying that tens of thousands of people have been killed there. Of course, that has not been independently verified, but even so, if that were true, that is, of course, a very, very significant and tragic loss indeed. Just to put that into some historical perspective for British listeners, throughout the entirety of the Second World War, there were around 100,000 citizens lost in Britain to German air raids and sinking of ships, etc. Now, that was a war that lasted for 6 years. This is one that has lasted only a matter of weeks. And so this is truly an enormous loss, if true, for the Ukrainian people. Just a few other things as well. Russian forces are said to be potentially considering to be using phosphorus munitions in Donetsk as part of this renewed offensive. And that is believed part of a even more vicious strategy being conducted by the general who was involved in the bombing of Syrian cities several years ago. The sort of devastation and chemical weapons that were used there were very much part of his strategy of devastation, and there is concern that that's going to be in the sort of tactical and military toolkit being deployed there in those regions. So lots to be concerned about. And just lastly, I would just comment on a couple of other interesting things in the sort of more diplomatic military space, which is that NATO have said that they will be drawing up plans to deploy a full-scale military force on its border in an effort to combat Russian aggression. This is, of course, very significant because up until now, NATO forces in countries like Estonia and Latvia have been mostly there just as a deterrent. They've been sort of minor bases, peacekeeping missions almost. But now, of course, they are building up a military capacity to be able to resist an actual Russian invasion. Clearly, there is enough concern that the Russia may attempt to do that as part of a long-term strategy that the NATO officials, world leaders, believe that it is beneficial for them to have a full-scale military force. So quite a considerable and eventful couple of days since we last did this podcast, and ones that I think will have ramifications for days and weeks to come.
Mutaz Ahmed.
I think Francis is of course right about the redeployment to the east. It's now in full swing. Basically, you're seeing columns of tanks, and the Russians will be hoping not just to fight westwards from the east, but to encircle some of the troops in the east. And as we know, that there are battalions in eastern Ukraine, Ukrainian battalions that have been there for a very long time, and some of them are the most highly trained soldiers that the Ukrainians have. So if they're encircled or cut off from the rest of the Ukrainian army, then of course that'll be a very serious problem. The war is going to enter a new stage now. It's going to be more violent. The conditions for Russian tanks in the east, I think, are slightly better. The Russians will have several advantages that they didn't have in the suburbs of Kyiv. And so the Ukrainians are going to need lots and lots of support. But there is a chance that... So this move means that Russia... It's an attempt by Russia to regain the initiative, basically. But there is a chance that Ukraine can hold on to the momentum it's gathered already, and actually push Russia back to Donetsk and Luhansk, forbidding them from taking the whole of Donbass. And there was an interesting report out recently from the Institute for the Study of War in the United States that said there's a chance for Ukraine to regain the whole of the Donbass. So the war's entering a new stage. It's as unpredictable as ever. But one thing's for sure, it's about to get much more violent. There are fewer civilians to deal with, but it's going to be a much dirtier army-on-army campaign.
Olivia Utley.
Yeah, and as we said in our leader this morning, I think that the scenario that's got to be avoided is if control of the coastline, and that means that Ukraine would be cut off from the Black Sea, which would make it impossible to trade. So I think we've got all these feel-good stories. You see Boris Johnson in Kyiv, and it is fantastic considering where we were 2 weeks ago, that Kyiv is now safe enough to visit. But we shouldn't get lulled into a sort of full sense of security because as Francis and Mutaz have said, the conditions in this next phase of the war are actually quite favourable to the Russian army.
Francis.
I think it's absolutely true what both Olivia and Mutaz are saying, that this war is now going to escalate into a more traditional style of warfare of tanks and infantry on infantry. And of course, President Zelensky has made that remarks himself. He said that some of the scenes that we will see in the Donbass will resemble those in the Second World War. But I would say as well that there are certain things, as I've commented before on this podcast, that would play in favour of the Ukrainians, which is that, of course, it's been winter, the ground has been harder, icier. That does make it easier, in theory at least, for tanks and heavy weaponry to be utilised. That is going to change as the weather turns into spring. These things, the pathways, the roads are going to become much muddier. That makes it much more challenging for the use of heavy weaponry. And not only that, there's going to be a renewed, with the expansion of spring-like weather in terms of foliage and hedgerows and things like that. That makes it much easier for guerrilla-style strategies in certain areas as well. Which, if it's the Russians who are making the initial offensive, which is what we would predict, that there will be an initial offensive from the Russians, which the Ukrainians will resist, and then there will be a counterattack from the Ukrainians, like we saw in the first phase of the war. Then that would be favourable for defensive warfare. These hedgerows and foliage and muddy roads. So I think it's too early to say who is advantaged at this stage of the conflict. But I think you have to say, given everything that has occurred in these past few weeks, that the momentum, at least diplomatically, militarily, is with the Ukrainian people and with President Zelensky.
Just before we move on to talking about Boris Johnson's visit to Kyiv, there was a fascinating piece in the paper on the British involvement in training the Ukrainian army and detailing how the British trainers and soldiers go in and almost remade or added so much to the Ukrainian capacity to defend their country. Francis, could you tell us about it? What exactly did the Brits do?
So Dominic Nicholls has written a really fascinating piece for our paper about the years leading up to the conflict so far. Of course, many will remember who are listening the annexation of Crimea by the Russians in 2014 and the sort of shockwaves that sent. And at the time, the feeling was that really Ukraine was clearly a country that was not capable of defending itself, given the scale of the defeat there and the seizure of Crimea and these independent regions later, Donetsk and Luhansk, by rebels, Russian-backed rebels. And perhaps, so we believe, also some Russian soldiers in disguise. But that was fundamentally changed by, and this is what Dominic writes about, that was fundamentally changed by Britain and other world leaders sending military advisors in the years after the invasion to effectively rebuild the Ukrainian army. And in this piece, Dominic documents the chronology of this and effectively how we were providing substantial military training, advice on what to do in certain military scenarios of Russian invasions, and it would appear that has, of course, very much paid off in this conflict, that there has been an essential renaissance in the Ukrainian capacity to militarily adapt to this. But a few other interesting remarks made by Sir Nick Parker, who was our sort of man on the ground in Ukraine as part of this initiative. And he says that his worry is that there is a kind of acceptance in the Western world that the Donbass will forever be, or perhaps not forever, but for a prolonged period, be a contested place, a contested region in Europe, and that there may well be a contested border and things like that. And he's worried about that he says that Ukraine must not be allowed to be a constant battle, that there must be some definitive victory. And of course, he is very favourable for that victory to be on the half of the Ukrainians. And we've commented before about, in the geopolitical sense, that it's absolutely vital that Putin is not able to leave this war with successes, with victories under his belt, because if he does, that will entirely change the landscape, not only of Europe, but of sort of the Western capacity to adapt to challenges from China and elsewhere. So a very, very interesting read that Dominic's put together, and I'd highly recommend that people read it, and just how much has been going on behind the scenes that has enabled this Ukrainian success so far. And it's a testament to a far more complex Western military strategy than I think people have previously realised. We're in a much more complicated space than just traditional warfare these days.
People used to laugh at Operation Orbital. It was one of those things where a journalist would ask a minister, why aren't you doing more in Eastern Europe? And the minister would say, well, training troops in Ukraine. And the journalist would respond, yeah, you have 100 soldiers in Kyiv. What's that going to do? And that's what it was, really. It was about 100 soldiers. This wasn't a huge operation, and yet they managed to train 22,000 or however many Ukrainian soldiers. And Operation Orbital expanded into sort of joint exercises involving paratroopers and maritime operations. So it wasn't always seen as a masterstroke. Up until very recently, it was seen as a sort of minor intervention by the UK. But of course, those logistical skills, bringing the Ukrainian army into line with sort of NATO logistics and tactics, in the grand scheme of things, made a huge difference. So it was more sort of accident than master strategy, but it worked out in the end, and the Ukrainians are super thankful for it. It's an example of what you can do actually with a very nimble small team. And lots of technology.
Thanks, Mutaz. Olivia Utley, would you tell us a little bit about Boris Johnson's trip to Kyiv? What did he do while he was there? How was it received?
Yeah, I mean, I think the first thing to mention is that it went down incredibly well. you could see there are some fantastic videos of Boris Johnson sort of wandering around the streets of Ukraine, speaking to Ukrainians who were just incredibly grateful for what Britain has been doing. And I think it was a good opportunity for Boris Johnson to show himself as a kind of, global leader. The post-Brexit Britain, we've always said that we're going to be this big outward-looking country that's nimble enough to make its own decisions without the EU. And I think Boris Johnson sort of embodied that while he was in Ukraine. It was quite funny sort of seeing what was happening on Twitter. I noticed Alistair Campbell tweeted saying that Ursula von der Leyen's going to Kyiv, but Boris said he wants to go, but he doesn't have the guts or something. And actually, Boris was already there, so it was quite a good sort of good moment for Boris to prove himself as the kind of prime minister that he's wanted to be and hasn't really been able to do because of COVID and etc. I mean, it is quite a good distraction watching Boris there, because it does sort of distract from the fact that actually what's happening. It is great that, as I was saying, it is great that it's safe enough for Boris to go to Kyiv, but the war isn't really in Kyiv anymore, and Russia is regrouping. It doesn't look like Putin's about to kind of back down and admit defeat, and the fact that the war's moved on from Kyiv doesn't really signify that. It does just suggest that, as we've discussed, that Russian forces are going to regroup around the south. And that is actually very dangerous, because it could cut Ukraine off in trading terms for quite a long time. The ramifications could last for a long time. I mean, other things, it's great that it's more than pretty much any other European leader has done, and it does sort of underline just how strong Britain's been since the start of this.
So this visit happened after Ursula von der Leyen was also in Kyiv. Francis and Mutaz, what are the diplomatic developments that surrounded these visits? What else is going on?
It's interesting that you note that, because they were different types of trips to Kyiv. The Ursula von der Leyen trip involved a lot of pressure from Zelensky for more EU support. She was taken to Bucha to see the massacres there. It was almost an attempt to show her just how bad, and to show Joseph Borrell, the EU foreign minister, just how bad things were, in an effort to get the EU to do more. The trip by Boris Johnson was more celebratory. We established very early on that Boris and Zelensky have an incredibly close relationship. It's one that I don't think we understand properly yet, but they are, it seems, in constant communication on WhatsApp. It's been reported. And their walk around Kyiv was more celebratory, as I said, and there were a lot more thank yous, Boris Johnson, and that's because at the start of this war, the most important objective for Zelensky and for Ukraine was to secure Ukraine's independence and sovereignty as a nation, and to do that, you need Kyiv. Just ignore the land battle and the south and the east for a moment. For Ukraine to survive, it needed Kyiv, and Boris's trip really signified that Ukraine as a nation state had survived. There's a question over land. Finland lost land, but survived. Ukraine may ultimately lose land, but it will survive. And that's in part, at least, thanks to the UK's contribution. What surrounds this diplomatically is, with these world leaders going to Ukraine, it's a great piece of, dare I say, propaganda for the Ukrainian government, because it gives them authority, and it gives Ukraine the world's sort of stamp of recognition that Ukraine has survived, and that the government is legitimate, and the government continues, and that Kyiv is a city that is considered safe for even world leaders. So that's a very important diplomatic step, and it just adds to Ukraine's increasing leverage in the negotiations with Russia.
I agree completely with Mutaz's comment on the differences between those two trips from Ursula von der Leyen and Boris Johnson. I think it's worth saying that the former's trip, representing the European Union, was also a moment where the European Union was meant to be extending and accelerating the Ukrainians' attempt to become a future member of the European Union. That, of course, has been something that they were promised early on in the conflict, that if they chose to apply, which is what Ukraine has done, that they would be fast-tracked, that would be expedited. And this was a formal attempt to show that process was ongoing. So it was significant for that reason. But as Mutaz rightly says, I think that there was very much a sense here that President Zelensky has still been very critical of the European Union and wanted to show just the extent of, essentially the failures of the European response to the war so far, in contrast to Britain's support. Just something else I think that's worth pointing out on the Boris trip is, for all of the fantastic images that have been coming out of seeing that Kyiv is now essentially liberated, it's slightly a misdemeanor to think that suddenly it's reconnected to Europe in the way that we might expect. It took Boris, we hear, about 14 hours to get there from Poland via the railways. Normally it would take a considerably less amount of time than that. Clearly, this is a country that still is infrastructurally facing extreme challenges as a consequence of the Russian war there. Of course, there's also the security element. It's worth saying that Boris went in secret. There was no UK media with him. All of the pictures and images that we've had have come from the Ukrainian media. And it would appear that he almost went alone with a few security. And I think that the fact that it was kept under wraps just shows that still this is a country that is very much under Russian siege. It's a very effective image, as I say, but it does hide certain complexities, I think, of just how much of a threat that Kyiv is still under attack. I mean, the Chechenian leader, who obviously is very much an ally of Putin, still seems to believe that Kyiv will at some point be taken in this war. He may not have any intelligence to believe that, but clearly there are still very significant elements within the Russian state, but also within Russia's core allies that believe that this war is very far from over, and that any failures around Kyiv that have taken place in the first phase of the war will be rectified in the second. So this war is by no means over yet.
Thanks, Francis. There's been some other diplomatic news we need to talk about a little bit, I think. That's the first round of the French election that we mentioned on this podcast a few days ago, because we were thinking about how does the war in Ukraine affect national politics elsewhere in Europe and the world, and then what effect do those changes then have on the situation in Ukraine? I mean, it's a loop, it's a circle in some ways. So I don't know who wants to take this, but what happened in France, and why is it relevant to what we're discussing?
So I was in, as I said, in last week, I was in Paris and talking to some journalists out there and just trying to get a sense of what the significance of this vote will be on the European project and also within France. We've spoken before, so I don't want to go over too much about of the ground. People can listen in Friday's episode. But essentially, the significance of the vote on Sunday is that we now know who the two contenders for the French presidency will be. It will be the incumbent Emmanuel Macron, and it will be Marine Le Pen of the National Front. And these obviously have two sort of quite contrasting visions of France, but also particularly, and this is where it's significant to Ukraine, the European project. Marine Le Pen has been very critical of the European Union in the past, has been more sympathetic, I think it's fair to say, of Putin's repudiation of certain agendas of the European Union. I suppose perhaps one would shape it around the narrative of the culture wars. And of course, that's made very uncomfortable issue in this election is sort of photographs of her with shaking hands with Putin, etc. So, of course, if Marine Le Pen is able to win this election on the 24th, and there does seem to be a chance that will take place at least, then that will potentially have ramifications for European unity on the point of Ukraine. But just two other comments on France, because I think the first thing to say is that Marine Le Pen is often described as a far-right politician, and of course that is true on matters of her view on immigration and on culture, as I say. But also she is very much a socialist politician, at least from the Western perspective in America and Britain. Many of the policies that she has promised are very highly interventionist in the economy and in other areas of the state. And as a consequence of that, I think we shouldn't underestimate the capacity for her to potentially pull this off. In France, there is a cost of living crisis like there is in much of the West now, in part facilitated by the Ukraine crisis, but actually preceding that by many months and perhaps arguably even years. So, in an election that is being fought on a cost of living grounds, a politician who is from the outside, who is not the incumbent, and is also preaching lots of heavy interventionist policies around solving the cost of living crisis may well be able to pull it off. Although, as I say, the numbers and the statistics suggest that it will be quite challenging for her to defeat Emmanuel Macron. But just one last other comment I would make is that French history, French politics is forever shaped by this desire for revolution, transformational change, which of course Emmanuel Macron to some extent represented when he won the presidency last time, and this sort of arch conservatism. And this, you could trace this back, even further into the French Revolution and the 19th century. These two extremes are forever battling out, and the consequence of that is that you get a France that is to some extent forms a kind of centrist coalition that preaches profound change, but actually is incapable of doing anything that profound at all. Macron, of course, has been, I think, in many ways a failed president in terms of what he sought to achieve. He claimed that he would be a leader that would eradicate the far right, and yet, here we are, exactly a repeat of the election last time in terms of the contenders. And so I would argue that actually, this is just a repeat of a consistent cycle in French politics of extremism and conservatism battling it out and us getting neither. And thus a sort of gridlock is what occurs. And in a sense, France is becoming Europe's premier centrist power, albeit indirectly. And of course, that is not necessarily a good thing. This is a time when really one needs to have, I'd argued, firm leadership, firm principles, and economies that are able to adapt quickly and are not sort of bogged down in bureaucracy. And yet, unfortunately, it would appear that France is going down the exact same path as it has in recent years. And that is not necessarily going to be good for Europe's unity on these points strong term, regardless of who wins the presidency on the 24th of April.
Let's put this a little bit in perspective of the Ukraine-Russia war. Mutaz and Olivia, how does the French election in the next 2 weeks affect what could happen in Ukraine?
I think Francis's historical perspective is correct, but we talk about EU unity and Western unity, and Zelensky has already acknowledged that Western unity is fracturing, because really we've reached the edge of the comfort zone in terms of what we're willing to do with sanctions and military support. Anything else is going to be uncomfortable. The EU's biggest diplomatic power, the EU's biggest military power, for the first time last night in the history of the Fifth Republic, a majority of voters in France voted for anti-system parties. These are parties that fundamentally oppose the way in which the EU's biggest military and diplomatic power is governed, right? That is a big, big shift. It's a big moment, right? It is a fundamental change that I think we haven't yet clocked onto. And it may take until 2027 until we see it come fully to fruition. But basically, in this massive European country, you've got one mainstream party that is a one-man show, followed up by a series of extremist parties that are skeptical of NATO, skeptical of EU membership, and some of whom are sympathetic to Putin and what Putin stands for, which, in terms of some of Le Pen and Zemmour's voters, they see him as a true conservative. that's a big worry. It shows that democracy, well, perhaps democracy in France is fine, but political stability in France is overestimated at the moment. And what does that mean for Ukraine? Well, it means that if Le Pen wins in 2 weeks, you will have an EU that is basically paralyzed on all questions. It has other priorities too, which won't get fulfilled. So you will have even weaker support from the EU, which will be led then by Scholz, who's proven himself to be relatively lightweight and someone who's Eurosceptic. If Macron wins, which is expected, he will have a hard time governing. The parliamentary elections that follow will sort of resemble what we see today, this morning, which is a much more fractured society even than 2017, much less governable France. So you will see a slower EU still, and ultimately that hits Western confidence, and all these things benefit Vladimir Putin's efforts. I say what we saw during the campaign, though, was what we're going to see across, I think, most of Europe, but just at a faster pace, which is at the start of the war, Macron's ratings shot up because he looked more presidential. He was talking to Putin. He looked like a leader, and the French people respected that. He looked grand. And then Le Pen's ratings, closer to the election, shot up because she was talking about the cost of living crisis. And that's at least in part as a result of rising oil prices, rising energy prices because of the war in Ukraine. You're going to see that shift across the whole of Europe as everyone feels the impact of the war. And that will result, I'm afraid, in not less sympathy for Ukraine, but Ukraine dropping down the list of priorities because everyone's going to be struggling. And so last night was a reminder that this solidarity we've seen in the West is not necessarily going to be a permanent phenomenon.
If I could just add to something on that, I think I'd have I don't disagree with what Mutaz has said, but I think there's just one other perspective on this, which is that essentially it doesn't surprise me that we are seeing such fragmentation in Western politics. And of course, this has been going on for a very long time, arguably since the migrant crisis in 2015, when the European Union showed its incapacity to deal with a massive geopolitical issue that I think facilitated, or at least had an influence on the tone of the Brexit debate in Britain. Of course, it was also relevant, I think, to Trump's foreign policy, and of course it is now very relevant to Germany and to where Merkel was eventually defeated, and also to obviously the weakness in the French electoral situation as we've just currently been describing. But as I say, my perspective would be different because I think that ultimately the liberal consensus has failed. Right? I mean, you can see that particularly on foreign policy, it has been an utter disaster in Europe. So of course the European people are going to be looking elsewhere for solutions to this. I don't think it necessarily means a threat of the democratic system. I think actually it's more people looking elsewhere for solutions to what has been a complete disaster. I mean, if you look at Germany, of course, they are even now have been very heavily criticised today because it has not. It was said to have rejected an offer of repairing some tanks to send to Ukraine without even sort of checking how long those repairs would take. And of course, they have been said to be sending the European Union has been sending 34 billion pounds worth of euros worth of funds to Russia for their energy and gas during this crisis, and has only sent $1 billion in terms of military hardware to Ukraine. So this is a fundamental failure on so many areas, and we've also got the cost of living crisis as well, which is now permeating across the Western world. That in part is due to the lockdown policies, which have, of course, whatever one makes of them, there are now a lot of criticisms about certain decisions that were made trade during the pandemic and the economic damage that has triggered, not only in Britain but across the Western Hemisphere. And all of these sort of pigeons are coming home to roost. And so it doesn't surprise me that we are in the situation where the established political parties, like traditionally one would see in France, are nowhere to be seen, and of course in Germany as well, because fundamentally their project has failed. Their complacency in the last 30 years has led to an unmitigated crisis and atrocities being committed on the European doorstep. And so, people are no doubt going to be looking for anti-establishment parties, and particularly when they are feeling it at home as well in their own wallets. So I think this is only the beginning of a transformational shift, and it is up to the political elite of the West to adapt to what the people want. It shouldn't be the other way around.
Thank you, Francis. Just to start thinking about wrapping up, there are quite a few notes, Francis, I've seen you've put in about Russia and the economic crisis that Russian people are facing as well. Mutaz, Olivia and Francis, can we talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, I mean, I was reading one very interesting piece in the Telegraph this morning, actually, by a Russian expert, a lecturer in Russian at the University of Oxford, who was saying it's not exactly about the economic impact, but it all ties together. What's going on in Russia, which we're not really hearing about over here, is that the state media has gone into overdrive, basically. For quite a long time, it was thought that there wasn't going to be invasion. Even in Russia, it was thought there wasn't going to be invasion of Ukraine because they weren't really hearing anything about it. Whereas just before the annexation of Crimea, there was all sorts of sort of state propaganda churning out material that persuaded the Russian people that Putin would be right to do that. Whereas this time we didn't really see that. And now it sort of feels as though they're making up for lost time. So she watches quite a lot of Russian TV, this lecturer, and she was saying that that's just basically all you can see now on Russian TV is extremely heavy-handed propaganda about how, to rid Ukraine of Nazism, we have to destroy the whole idea of the country, and all of it, so many stupid conspiracy theories about Russians killing their own troops in Bucha or whatever to make Ukraine, to make Russia look bad. It's mad stuff being pumped out all the time, and Russian people are watching it all the time. And so she's worrying about the idea that actually Putin sort of unleashed this whirlwind that he can't now really control. State TV is pumping out all this stuff. The Russian people are watching it and obviously getting more and more angry at Ukraine and feel as though, of course, Ukraine must be ended. That's the only way for Russia to take the next step forward in its future. So you feel like the Russian people are becoming sort of more and more furious and harder to kind of rein in. And I think we've sort of hoped for quite a long time that as soon as the economic impacts start hitting Russians properly, which obviously they are beginning to now, the Russian people might sort of turn on Putin, and there'd be some kind of coup, or Putin would be ousted from power in some way by kind of these young Russians who are quite Western in their outlook and who don't much like Putin. But there's also the other side of that coin, which is that the angrier they get and the worse their lives get in Russia, the more furious they become with Ukraine and the more kind of bloodlust there is. And actually, Russians' lives getting far, far worse means that peace becomes ever less attainable, and the ladder for Putin to climb down gets sort of longer and longer. So I think that's quite an interesting way of looking at it, and quite worrying too.
Absolutely. Thanks, Olivia. Just to say quickly, if you want to hear a Russian perspective on the war, and very much linking with everything Olivia is saying about what Russians are seeing on their TV and on their news programs, we did interview Natalia Vasilyeva, who's the Telegraph's Moscow correspondent. I believe that's last Wednesday's podcast, and she gives a very, very interesting and chilling account of opposition in Russia, and as you're saying, Olivia, what exactly Russians are seeing. So if you're listening and you want to hear more about that, I would suggest going to your podcast apps, finding Ukraine the latest, and listening to our interview with Natalia Vasilyeva. I don't have it in front of me. I believe it's last Wednesday.
A lot of Russians still think the pain they're feeling at the moment is temporary, and this tends to happen with sanctions. I used to hear stories from my family in Sudan, which was under sanctions for 20 years. Right. At first, you have this rally around the flag effect. People see it as an act of war, and imposing sanctions these days, on the scale they've been imposed on Russia, it is an act of war, really. And you saw people rally around Putin. And the second thing is that people's natural instinct is to make themselves believe that it's all temporary. It's all going to go away. So you go to malls and you see signs on shops that can't open because they can't import the clothes they're selling. And the signs will say, reopening soon. We're out of stock, but we're coming back. And there's not this recognition that, no, this is your new way of life. You need to adapt to this much degraded social life, this much degraded economic activity. There's no sense of that. It's almost like the start of the pandemic here, right? A lot of people thought we'd been locked down for 3 weeks. They were willing to tolerate those 3 weeks. It was 3 months after that. They were willing to tolerate it. I think if people were told you'd been locked down for 2 years at the start of lockdown, there'd be a lot more friction. And so we're seeing something similar in Russia at the moment. But ultimately, people do wake up to the reality. It takes years usually, but they do wake up. And when they realize that actually their lives and their children's lives are permanently degraded, it's not going to improve. Those clothes, those McDonald's, those Western stuff, they're not coming back. Things deteriorate very quickly. So we shouldn't expect that anytime soon. But, don't expect sanctions to have an immediate effect on public opinion. It takes time. But it does get more and more dangerous for the president or the government the longer it goes on for.
If I could just make one comment on, I completely agree with that. I think that's a really fascinating comparison to make with COVID and the impact of that on the Western sort of mentality and the politicians and the public as well. I just wanted to say something on picking up on what Olivia said about the severity of the sanctions in Russia. So today we've heard that Russia's facing a historic sovereign default after the US Treasury blocked the country's dollar payments. So the last time that the Russian economy was forced to default on foreign debt was a very significant date in Russian history, 1917, in the Bolshevik Revolution. And of course, this is. I'm not saying that we're going to have a similar thing in Russia for the reasons that Mutaz has just highlighted, at least not in the short term. But it's those kind of historical parallels that make. So we understand Vladimir Putin very jumpy. Almost his entire career has been built on preventing there being any chance of attempts to overthrow him in Russia. That he would rather go estimating the risk than underestimating the risk, and so those kind of parallels, I think, will be a cause of concern. And of course, the Russian finance minister has come out and been highly critical of the sanctions policy, saying that this is an unnecessary default, that it's only happening because they've not got access to the funds, rather than any real profound vulnerability in the Russian economy. But even so, I think it is significant that we're starting to see the sanctions having quite significant effects on the way that the Russian economy is viewed around the world, despite what the ruble price is, which is currently at levels that were as sort of high as they were before the conflict. Just whilst we're on the subject of Russia, I think this is a question, and I'd be interested to hear everyone else's takes on this. But I was reading a comment put out by Dr. Jade McGlynn, who writes for us in the Telegraph. I believe she wrote for us yesterday. And she was saying that why do we still, when we're reporting the incidents in Mariupol and elsewhere, where we know that atrocities are taking place caused by the Russian forces, why do we still report what the Kremlin's line is on this? That they deny this. You wouldn't ask Islamic State what their line is on attacks taking place. We would dismiss that out of hand. And I think it's a really interesting point that she raises. I think it's right that we do report that because it speaks to what the Russians are hearing, what the Russian mentality is on the conflict, even if they are lies. I don't believe it's spreading sort of propaganda. But I think it also speaks to perhaps a belief deeply ingrained, maybe, that at some point Russia will come back into the international community, that we haven't given up on the Russian state or the Russian people yet, that they are still a part enough of the international community that we should still report what the Kremlin says as being a source of some credibility, regardless how thin that is. And I think that's probably for the best, that we don't completely make Russia a sort of North Korea pariah state, even if at this present moment what they're pumping out is clearly ludicrous. But I'd be interested to hear other people's perspectives on that, because I thought it was an interesting and thought-provoking point.
It is interesting. I tend to agree with you. I think we probably should report what the Kremlin says, and it doesn't do Ukraine too much harm, because increasingly we see just how ridiculous the Kremlin's claims are, and you know, I don't think the Kremlin cares anymore how ridiculous they sound, but it's good for people to sort of use their own initiative to sort of realize that these people are, you know, they're really nasty buggers, and they don't really care about facts. As for sanctions, by the way, the only economic reality that matters at the moment is how much money are we giving Putin to spend on his military. In my view, those are the only sanctions that matter, and all that money, or most of it, comes from natural resources, gas and oil. What are the sanctions on gas and oil? And clearly, we're nowhere near where we need to be in terms of that. We're still, in terms of the EU, is still buying up billions of dollars of Russian national resources, which goes straight into the Kremlin's coffers, which goes straight into, you know, tanks and bombs, and perhaps even air defense systems for Serbia and so on. That's the only thing that matters, and ironically, that's the only area really that outstanding where we've done very little.
Thank you, Mutaz, and thank you, Francis. I think we probably need to start wrapping up. So can I have all of your final thoughts on just what to look for in the coming days?
I would just say that we are yet to see the true extent of the renewed Russian assault in the Donbass. I think we can expect that this is going to be, as Mutaz was saying earlier on, a particularly grim kind of war, one that we have not seen on European soil since the Second World War, in terms of tanks and infantry attacking each other with full force, rather than, as we were saying earlier on, more of a defensive war, a guerrilla war that was being fought in the early phases of this. And so I think that when we start to see some of the pictures, some of the analysis of that, I think the true scale of this conflict will come home to us. And I think in that sense, we've been debating on this podcast for some time now whether, you know, the negotiations with Russia would suddenly lead to a ceasefire, and whether, as part of that arrangement, that the Donbass, Luhansk, Donetsk, Crimea would be given to Russia more permanently in exchange for peace. That is now looking increasingly unlikely. I think Ukraine is seeking to go for total victory over the Russian forces, and it remains to be seen whether they are actually capable of that. And we forget, of course, and I know it's sort of rather alarmist to highlight this, but we've commented before on Putin's capacity for ruthlessness, his lack of fear in threatening the use of nuclear weapons. If things really, really get dire, he could, you know, seriously try and escalate this war with use of tactical nuclear weapons in Ukraine. We shouldn't underestimate that as a possible threat here. And so it's just something to be sensitive to, that I think many of us are starting to get into this sort of frame of mind of thinking, oh, well, it's looking now very likely that Ukraine are going to seize back almost all of their lost territory and score a incredible historic victory against Vladimir Putin's forces. It's way too early to say that, because unfortunately Putin still has a lot of cards left to play, and let's hope he doesn't use them. But if he does, we are going to be in a completely different phase, and one that I think will be even more concerning than what we have seen so far. I hope I'm wrong, but we are yet to know.
I think I'd say keep an eye on what's going on in France, because, as we've discussed, the outcome of this election really matters, and it isn't just whether Macron or Le Pen wins the election. It's also about voter numbers, because we saw in the first round extremely low turnout, and I think there is actually quite a danger in Macron winning, but but winning narrowly and with a very disillusioned electorate, because then you see the sort of rising voter apathy, and that apathy can quite easily sort of morph into anger. And as Mutaz says, there are quite a lot of French people who are voting for Zemmour and Le Pen who are quite sympathetic to Vladimir Putin. And if those voters are feeling disaffected and angry, then that's really going to sort of undermine a second Macron term, and could play havoc with the stability of the EU, with NATO, etc. So in some ways that could be the worst outcome. But I think keep an eye.
Yeah, I agree with both Liv and Francis, and I'm afraid it's probably going to be just as depressing. But one country that's really interesting me is Lithuania, which is taking a much bolder approach to supporting Ukraine. It's talking about repairing Ukrainian tanks on Lithuanian soil, training Ukrainian troops on Lithuanian soil. It looks like it's about to take a much more active role in the conflict, and perhaps it can become, along with Poland, a sort of an important sort of middle state between the West and Ukraine, where we can hopefully put resources, and those resources can end up making a difference on the battlefield. So keep an eye on Lithuania. Everything that's happening there is very exciting.
Ukraine the Latest is an original podcast from The Telegraph. To stay on top of all of our Ukraine news, analysis and dispatches from the ground, subscribe to The Telegraph. You can get your first 30 days completely free at telegraph.co.uk/audio. Or sign up to Dispatches, our daily Ukraine newsletter, which brings stories from our award-winning foreign correspondents straight to your inbox. You can listen to this conversation live at 1 p.m. each weekday on Twitter Spaces. Follow The Telegraph on Twitter so that you don't miss it. If you enjoyed this podcast, please consider following Ukraine the Latest on your preferred podcast app and leave a review, as it helps others find the show. You can also get in touch directly with us by emailing podcasts@telegraph.co.uk. We do read every message. Ukraine the Latest is produced by Louisa Wells and Giles Gear, and on Twitter, Sophie Coe.